Okay, today's lesson is over section 4.5. We're using congruent triangles in this lesson. Using congruent triangles. Now, today we are doing all proofs. Okay, there is not one problem that we're going to do on our assignment in the examples or anything that will not be proofs. Okay, these are all proofs today. So let's get this first proof set up. Copy this down as I draw it. Once again, I'm still not an artist. I have points A, B, C, and D. And I have a line coming through the middle like that. They tell me, by given information, that AB is parallel to CD. BC is parallel to DA. Okay? And we want to prove that AB is parallel to C, or excuse me, to CD. Yes. Prove AB is parallel to CD. Okay. So let's take a look at that. We want to get our statements and our reasons set up. And go ahead and get our givens listed here. AB parallel to CD and BC parallel to DA. All because they are given. Okay. Step 2. Okay, now, first thing we should do, now that we have our diagram and we have our givens, is what? Raise your hand when you know the answer to this question. If you do not know the answer to this question, you need to be talking to your neighbor and figuring it out. What should I do once I have my diagram drawn and I know my givens? Okay, you all should have came up with the answer that we need to mark our diagram. Okay, so let's mark that AB is parallel to CD. Okay, parallel, parallel. Okay, I must have something messed up. I want to prove that AB is congruent to CD, my fault. Okay, change that to congruent. Alright, and I know that BC is parallel to AD. Okay, so now I have my given information marked. Okay, with that information, what can I conclude about my diagram that's going to help me say that AD is congruent, or excuse me, AB is congruent to CD? Okay, we're going to have to come up with some information. Okay, there's a lot of different ways to do this. Okay, the first thing that we should know though is with our two triangles, BAD and DCB, we should be able to tell that BD is in both of those. Okay, so with that, using our reflexive property, which we've talked about for a long time now, we should know that BD is congruent to BD. And the reason is because it's reflexive. Okay, we know, using the reflexive property, that everything is congruent to itself. Okay, so we have that BD is congruent to BD. And what else can we use knowing our parallel lines? Okay, use the information of your parallel lines. When you can think of something else to say because of parallel lines, raise your hand. If you cannot think of anything, you need to be talking to your neighbor to try to figure this out. Okay, I just want to know one statement that you can come up with because of the parallel lines that we have. Okay, we should have came up with, this is one option. Once again, there's many options that you can do here. Okay, we should have came up with possibly that ABC, or excuse me, ABD is congruent to CDB. We should be able to tell that those two angles, this one here, are congruent to each other. Okay, so ABD angle ABD is congruent to angle CDB. When you can tell me why ABD is congruent to CDB, raise your hand. If you cannot, you need to talk to your partner and try to figure this out. Why is ABD congruent to CDB? Hopefully we all came up with the fact that we have alternate interior angles. Okay, so our reason is because they are alternate interior angles. Okay, well, we still don't have enough information to prove that AD is congruent to BC. Or excuse me, that AB is congruent to CD. Okay, we don't have enough information to prove that yet. Okay, we have an angle and we have a side, okay, but we need something else. Okay, we need another angle. Okay, so is there any way I can prove that this angle is congruent to this angle? If you know the answer to that question, raise your hand. If not, talk to your neighbor and try to figure that out. Can I prove that CBD, this angle here, can I prove that it is congruent to ADB right here? You should have came up with yes using our same reason. Okay, so we should be able to say now that angle ADB is congruent to CBD Again, they are alternate interior angles. So this should have 2 tick marks, and this should have 2 tick marks now. Okay, so that's what your diagram should look like right now. Okay, and we have alternate interior angles. Okay, well, we still haven't proved it. We still need to prove that AB is congruent to CD. And we know that they're parallel. We used all the information there that we could. Okay, but now we need to say whether they are congruent. Okay? If you can tell me why those 2 segments are congruent, raise your hand. Otherwise, you need to talk to your neighbor and figure it out. Why is AB congruent to CD? Okay. AB is congruent to CD. Okay. Hopefully you guys came up with the fact it is congruent because of CPCTC. Remember, corresponding parts of congruent triangles have to be congruent. Okay? So our triangles, we actually missed a step here. Okay, well, let's move this down. Okay, this is step 6. My fault. Step 6. And I still make mistakes even on video. Alright? Let's first say our triangles are congruent. Let's say ABD, triangle ABD, is congruent to triangle CBD. CDB. Okay, make sure that your parts of your triangle are corresponding. Okay. And we did that because of angle, side, angle. Okay, notice I had an angle, a side, an angle, angle, side, angle. So we did that because of angle, side, angle. Okay, now we have our proof done. So make sure you insert that step 5, and change this CPCTC to step 6. Okay, again, if you have questions, you need to be helping each other out. Okay, talk to each other, make sure everybody is understanding. Okay, so that was on page 229 with 4.5. Let's do another one. We're looking at page 230 now, moving on to our next proof. Okay, so draw this diagram as I do. You're going to want these in your notes. Okay, so don't think you're just going to get them out of the book. Get them in your notes as well. Okay, I have SMATR. Okay. And my given information, they tell me that A is the midpoint of MT, A is the midpoint of MT and SR. Okay, and I want to prove that MS is parallel to RT. Okay, so get that drawn up. Make sure you get your two-column proof set up with your statements and your reasons. I'll scroll back up here so you can see that still. A is midpoint of MT and SR. Those are our givens. Give me 1 second here. Okay, sorry about that. Now, we know that they're the midpoints. Okay, so we want to make sure, once we have all this drawn, we want to make sure that we get all of our information, again, from our givens, marked on our diagram. Okay, so if I know that A is the midpoint, okay, that really doesn't tell us much that we can mark. Now, does it give us some information? Yes. So when you can tell me what information we know, since A is the midpoint of MT and SR, raise your hand. If you do not know the answer to this question, you need to be talking to your neighbor to figure this out. What does it mean if A is the midpoint of those two segments? Okay. We should have came up with that MA is congruent to MT. Right? If you write it, or excuse me, if you mark it, you need to write it. MA is congruent to AT. Okay, MA, AT. Reason? Okay, we should have had definition of midpoint. Okay, because by the definition of a midpoint, we know that that point splits this whole segment in half. Okay, what else did we come up with? There's one more thing we can mark because A is the midpoint. Okay, use the information of SR. When you know the answer to this question, raise your hand. Okay, hopefully we all came up with that SA is then congruent to AR. Okay, so that should be our step 3. SA is congruent to AR. Same reason, definition of midpoint. And keep in mind you could have combined those into one step if you wanted to. Okay? Now, we need to prove that MS is parallel to RT. Okay? Before we can do that, we are going to have to figure out, first of all, we need to either show that we have alternate interior angles, because we can use alternate interior angles converse. Okay? You can either have those here or here. Okay? You can have it with M congruent to T or R congruent to S. But keep in mind the ways that we can prove parallel lines. So somehow we have to get those angles congruent. Right? To get those angles congruent, since we have triangles, we are probably going to have to prove that triangles are congruent. Right? Do we have enough information right now to prove that triangles are congruent? If you know the answer to this question, raise your hand. If you do not, you need to talk to your neighbor and ask them, do we have enough information to prove triangles are congruent? Okay, you should have came up with no, we do not. Okay, so well, what's the next step? You should also know something about these two angles. Okay, you should know that these two angles are vertical angles. Okay, so MAS, angle MAS is congruent to angle RAT. And the reason for that is vertical angles. Okay. Now do we have enough information to prove my triangle is congruent? When you know the answer to this question, raise your hand. If not, you need to talk to your neighbor. Okay. Are these triangles congruent? If so, what theorem or postulate says that they are congruent? Hopefully we all came up with, yes, we can prove that they are congruent. And the reason they are congruent is because we have side, angle, side. Side, angle, side. So we know that MAS, triangle MAS, is congruent to triangle TAR. And the reason was side, angle, side. Okay. Well, we're still not to parallel lines. Hey, remember, we wanted to prove either those two angles congruent to each other or S and R congruent to each other. Okay, either one is fine. Let's go ahead and say that angle M is congruent to angle T. Okay, M is congruent to T. When you can tell me why those two angles are congruent, M and T, raise your hand. If not, you need to talk to your partner and figure this out. Once I prove triangles congruent, what is my next step always going to be? Okay, remember, your next step is always going to be CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. That is always true. That will always be your step after you prove triangles congruent, right here. Okay. Now that I have those angles congruent to each other, what do I know about my lines? MS and RT. When you know the answer to this question, raise your hand. If not, talk to your neighbor. Make sure you are figuring this out. Why is MS parallel to RT? Keep in mind the ways we can prove parallel lines. Okay, I know that MS is parallel to RT because of alternate interior angles converse. So your step 7 should be the MS parallel to RT, alternate interior angles converse. Again, I can't stress enough, you need to be talking to your classmates, helping each other out. Okay, we have to help each other out on this while I'm gone. Okay, we have one more proof for today. Okay, in your notes. The reason I want these in your notes is because these are good proofs to study for before tests. Okay, before a test, go back, forget about all we did, and try to reproduce this proof on your own. Okay, that's what we need to do. There's a test a week from today or tomorrow. Okay, so let's get our last proof drawn out here. If I can find my black marker. There we go. Okay, so we have a kite-like diagram here. Not bad for not being an artist. A, B, C, D. And point E here in the middle. Okay, and it's nice. They mark some information for us. They tell us this is angle 1, this is angle 2, 3 and 4. And they also tell us that that is congruent to this one, and that these two are congruent. Okay, and in our given information, they give us more of what they already showed us. They tell us that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and that angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. Right? And we want to prove that triangle BCE is congruent to DCE. Is congruent to triangle DCE. Okay? So we want to prove that BCE is congruent to DCE. Okay? Get your statements and your reasons set up. So you can see that. Get written in here, angle 1 congruent to angle 2, angle 3 congruent to angle 4. Those are all given. Alright. So make sure we have all that copied down. Okay, now this is a tricky proof, and the reason why is because we have to prove two triangles congruent to each other first, then we're going to use CP/CTC, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, and then we're going to go use that information and go back and prove that a different set of triangles is congruent to get to our proof. Okay, so what I want you to look at, first, forget about DB, okay, forget about that segment right there. We want to take a look at this big triangle on the bottom and this big triangle on the top. And those are the two triangles that we want to look at right now. Okay. Do I have enough information to prove these big triangles are congruent? When you know the answer to that question, raise your hand. With that given information, two angles congruent to each other, can I prove that my two large triangles are congruent to each other? If you don't know the answer, you need to be talking with your neighbor. Okay? We should have came up with no. Okay, we cannot prove these triangles congruent to each other. And we don't have any congruent theorem or postulate that says angle, angle. And we don't have that. And we do have an angle, side angle though. Can we prove that CA is congruent to CA? Sure we can. And we know that CA is congruent to CA. Why is that? Why is CA congruent to itself? Hey, talk with your neighbor real quick and discuss that. Why is that congruent to itself? What property? What theorem? And we should have came up with reflexive. Alright, everything is congruent to itself because of reflexive. Okay, again, if you write it, you need to mark it. Alright, I know it looks weird only having one tick mark on there, but that's what it's going to look like with our reflexive property. Now can I prove my large triangles congruent to each other? If I can, raise your hand. If you are not raising your hand, you need to ask your neighbor, why can you prove them congruent? Why can you prove those two large triangles are congruent to each other? It is possible. Now we need to know why. So my next statement, since it's possible, I need to say that ABC, triangle ABC, is congruent to triangle ADC. Triangle ADC. When you can tell me why those triangles are congruent to each other, right, what theorem or postulate, raise your hand. If you cannot, you need to be talking to somebody with their hand up. Why are those two large triangles congruent to each other? We should have came up with angle, side, angle. Angle, side, angle. And we should have angle, side, angle congruency here to prove our large triangles. Alright, so what? That has nothing to do with what they wanted to prove though. We wanted to prove BCE is congruent to DCE. Alright, what is our first step always going to be after we prove triangles congruent to each other? You know the answer to this question, raise your hand. What is our first step after we prove triangles congruent? You should have told me CPCTC. Remember, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. All right, the next question is, what does us any good? Anyone notice BCE is this triangle right here. And DCE is this triangle right here. We already know that these angles are congruent. What part of my large triangles are in my small triangles? And talk with your neighbor quickly. Decide what part of our large triangles is also in our small triangle. We should have came up with CB and DC. Okay, those two sides are still in our small triangle. So we know that these sides should be congruent to each other. Oh, better put two tick marks there. Okay, CB is congruent to CD. I got that right, yep. Because of CPCTC. Remember, this is always your first step after you prove triangles congruent. Always. This is always your first step. Okay? As soon as you prove triangles congruent, you're going to use CPCTC if you're going to go further. Okay? Now I have an angle and a side. Okay, we're done with the rest of this. We're done with this over here. We don't need it anymore. We used it. We're now talking about our small triangles. What do I need to know to prove these two triangles congruent? I'll give you a hint. It is reflexive. You need to give me the statement. Okay, think about what the statement is going to be. We're going to use reflexive. I need to know the statement. Okay, talk with your neighbor quickly. We should have came up with that CE is congruent to CE. Alright, so I'm going to put 3 tick marks there. Again, if you think it or mark it, you need to write it. CE is congruent to CE. I already told you the reason was going to be reflexive. Alright, now, is there enough information to prove that BCE, this triangle here, is congruent to DCE, the top triangle? Okay, can I prove those two triangles congruent? Talk to your neighbor quickly. If you think you can, talk about how. If you think you can prove them congruent, talk to your neighbor about how you're going to prove them congruent. What theorem? Should have said triangle BCE is congruent to triangle DCE because of side, angle, side. Side, angle, side. So we should have had side, angle, side. Now, this assignment today is going to take you some time. Right? It is. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some effort. I need you, if you have questions, you need to be talking to your classmates. I cannot stress that enough. Talk to your classmates about what you don't know. Right? Help others out with what you do know. I need you guys to be doing that for me. Help each other out. And your assignment today is page 232. Through 18. Okay, so you got 11 problems here. I need all of them in 2-column proofs. Okay, do all of them in 2-column proofs. They are not all meant to be in 2-column proofs, but you can still put them in 2-column proofs. 8, 9, and 10 are going to be a little bit shorter and easier than the others. Okay, take your time on this entire assignment. Use the 2-column proofs. Okay, use your theorems. Remember, CP/CTC always comes after you prove triangles congruent. Okay, some of your proofs are filled out a little bit for you. Some of them you have to produce on your own. Okay, use each other. Utilize your resources. Okay, help each other out. Have a good day.